Welcome back here with Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about this post by Orthodox Canonist on Twitter X. He has over 80,000 followers and is a passionate defender of all things Tsar Nicholas and the Russian Empire related. Some rather fanciful claims, so I figured we would take a gander and see how much validity, if any, they have to them. To begin, Tsar Nicholas II was the most successful leader of the 20th century. He increased the Russian population by 50 million in 20 years, greatly expanded labor rights, did not suppress trade unions, and introduced workplace insurance. That much is correct. You were better off being a worker under the Tsar, or let's say a German laborer with Mustache Man, than almost anything under the Soviets because they crushed independent labor unions. They were harsh to workers at their state-run industries. And if you were quite unlucky, you would go to a penal colony run by Naftali Frenkel, who pioneered the modern concept of work people until they die. This was not the Germans, despite what many liberal academics will falsely claim. He won the First World War. Whoa, okay, now we're getting interesting. Not sure how you would make that claim. The Russians lost 2.5 million men, equivalent to 50% of Allied casualties. This was because the Russian military was a disaster and had been for a long time. You had too many officers, not much of an NCO command structure, very poor tactics. They were known for fanning out into a full column and then advancing on fixed position, which is going to cost you a lot of people. You have to attempt at least some basic flanking, pincer movement. They had atrocious supply chains, so soldiers were known for being sent to the front without a weapon. Hey, wait till someone dies and then fight with what he's dropped. They were not producing enough ammunition based upon how much they were expending on a daily basis. And the military was operating independently. They were trying to cut deals to get replenishments and provisions, in some cases financially devastating to the Russian state. So there's more to the story than all this fantasy. Now, I do want to point something out because Tsar Nicholas, as we know, fell from power in 1917 and was killed next year in the summer, if I'm not mistaken. The war concluded later on that year. So saying he won the war is already a little bit questionable. But, and I found this other post by Canonist, I just had to scroll up a little bit. Many of these anti-Khyber Orthodox nationalists are very good at being extremely deceptive to their followers, and they like to conflate the early 1917 Russian Revolution, which brought Alexander Kerensky to power, with the later one that actually brought about the Bolsheviks, and they'll say, oh, it was all interconnected. So here, just to give you a sense of his mentality, he's referring to Kerensky going to this religious event. The Grand Master of all Russian Freemasonry attended the Orthodox Council as a guest of honor, surrounded by future martyrs. The demon-possessed Masons sat the council, attended the church services, smirking, knowing that in less than 6 months' time, the blood of Orthodox Christians will begin flowing like a river through the land, and nobody in the room could see it coming. All right, this is just completely nonsensical. Kerensky was many things, and yes, he was a Mason. That does not mean he was a genocidal maniac. And you can tell the people that don't bother learning and they just go about these, like, the voices in their head is what I would describe this. At least that's how my impression. He claims that it was Kerensky that legalized Freemasonry. Then he gets fact-checked down in the responses. It was actually Tsar Nicholas that made it acceptable. And when people question, like, why was Nicholas removed if he was so popular? Well, it was the Care Bear bankers, the Masons, that kind of thing, which is that's their go-to when they want to navel-gaze some more. So keeping in mind that Nicholas is murdered in 1918, but the same year the Germans, at least say in the spring, they're going, we're going to win. And they get this Brest-Litovsk or Litovsk, I know I'm butchering it, agreements, which there's different figures I've seen, but roughly speaking, 50% of Russia's industrial capacity and a third of its population is handed over to Berlin. You'll go, oh yeah, but it was not actually maintained. And okay, we could claim because the Russians bled them dry on the one front, they lost to the Western. Well, that just means that Tsar Nicholas and the Russian Empire were gullible puppets for the Rothschild bankers in Paris and London. See, these guys never actually stop and consider the implications of what they say because they're not interested. They just have to go back to Masons, commies, and Care Bears without any nuance, any degree of penetration deeper into the history. He established the first peace conference in world history at The Hague, 1898. I believe that was actually the Kaiser, but I'm sure he participated. Public education was made free, primary made compulsory, 10,000 schools opened every year. From a modern conservative perspective, because you'll see how this guy is trying to signal to the resistance to Biden types. Do you really want people going to government schools? I know this is a based government, so called, but it's still a form of indoctrination. If you took your run of the mill person who's grown up as a Protestant and put them, maybe not Russia at the time was so bad, but it definitely had much work to do. But if you put them under some Catholic or Orthodox regime back in the day, but with the knowledge and experience they have now, they would probably have a mental collapse because they wouldn't understand how difficult it was to express your opinions on certain things, especially as related to religion. Income tax fluctuated between 3.1 and 5%. This is lower than the British Empire, which controlled many overseas colonies, including, well, okay, Russia was more of a land power, but Russia controlled a lot of territories and colonies. So keep that in mind. When America introduced the income tax, it was quite low. I still would be curious how many of the Russian elites were even paying that tax, regardless of it being a small amount. Russia had the highest number of educated university level women in the world. How is that a flex? As he says later on, they're a Christian supremacist regime, but why would you want women getting college degrees? Overall, farmer Cossack land ownership skyrocketed from 133 to 261. 100% of all farmland in Asian Russia. Siberia is controlled by Russian farmers, 90% of that in European Russia. There's different ways of interpreting that because it's been said after they eliminated serfdom, the land wasn't entirely in the hands of the serf. There was still like the peasant commune that held some influence, and that may have retarded growth and expansion. Difficult to say because it's easy, especially given the information we have and the size of Russia. It's not necessarily simple to pin down. Between 1881 and 1914, 1.5 million Care Bears left the Russian Empire for the United States. But do you know why they were leaving? Do you know how they were being treated? I know that's all propaganda, but you can look into the riots after the assassination of Alexander II, 1881. By the way, Care Bears were not allowed to own weapons, so it was difficult for them to defend themselves. The pogrom in Odessa, and then Kishinev. There was a good recount written by David. He was not pro Care Bear. He disliked them, but he said that Zionism was the only solution. But he went around interviewing government officials, people who had been affected, and it was pretty clear that they stirred up this attack, and then like the police were breaking up any self-defense militias, trying to ensure this would happen. Religious authorities were blessing the rioters and trying to make excuses for them. You have women being raped, old people being beaten to death, children being killed, and well, it's okay because they brought it on themselves. Of course, when you ask for the clear evidence of how they brought it upon themselves, it's always dressed up in mysticism and hearsay. During his entire reign, the Tsar refused to dissolve the Pale settlement despite enormous pressure from the international community. Okay, so you have to keep in mind, because Kerensky did in fact get rid of the Pale. Why might he have done so? Well, because he was controlled by the Care Bear bankers. No, this is ignorance. Even up until 1914, the figure I've seen is that there was 600,000 displaced Care Bears wandering in the Russian Empire. And when the First World War began, another problem with the Russian military, they would advance, they're going through parts of Galicia, other regions, and they'd come upon Care Bear settlements. They would do what they were known for, which is to burn, loot, grape, kill people, displace them. So now you have a large population. Kerensky is already in a shaky position. He's trying to consolidate the economy, the government, such that it doesn't fall into more extreme revolution. Yeah, you need to begin allowing these people to integrate into the society and economy. If you don't, yeah, many of them are probably going to join the communists. Now, prior to those times, most Care Bears were part of the Care Bear oriented political groups, like the ones that were kind of trad, conservative, Care Bearism, the constitutional liberals, or the Mensheviks, social democrats. Mensheviks and Bolsheviks are not one and the same. And a lot of Mensheviks, including Mr. Kerensky, were either killed or sent into exile. There were also, this comes from an Orthodox Christian source, thousands of rabbis sent to concentration camps by the Soviets because they were seen as a threat to centralized obedience to communist state leadership. The monetary wealth of the average Russian increased almost threefold, which can be seen in smaller account holdings at banks, savings of 330 million to 1.2 billion rubles. That's good. Now, I want to make a point here. Some of these guys, maybe not in his post, but adjacent ones, will say they had no central bank and no debt. A couple of idiotic claims. There was a state bank established in the 1860s under Tsardom. They did commercial and private lending, and they may not have been fully nationalized like the Soviets, but Russia absolutely had debt. In fact, one of the first acts of the Soviets when they took power was to repudiate, cancel the debt held by the Russian Empire, by the Tsars. This enraged France, one of the major debt holders, and I believe they might have received some form of repayment under the Russian Federation in the 1990s, to give you a sense of the timeline. And I'm going to pop up here to the book real quick. Hopefully it will cooperate. It's not finished, so no judgment. Schiff co-signed the effort by informing senior Russian official Sergei Witte he would block all American loans to Russia so long as the persecution of Jews was tolerated. This is in relation to the Russo-Japanese War. Schiff had asked for an audience with the Tsar. He said, look, I can work with you, but you have to stop treating people in this horrendous fashion. The Russian government wasn't interested. And here we have from Vladimir Kokovstov, the finance minister. He dealt us a terrible blow by helping our enemy Japan at the most critical moment of our war. He made it possible for Japan to get a loan. He was one of the most dangerous men. Later here, there was not the slightest hope of floating either domestic or foreign loan. The only way out of this was to resort to new issues of paper money, that is, by preparing the way for complete financial and consequently economic collapse. It makes you think. You want to get involved in a war with another power that's going to allow you to expand and maybe get down into Asia, have influence in India, but you're so hung up on this social policy towards a minority group, and you're willing to basically commit suicide. And it's not just that, of course, because you can try to blame them for giving loans to the Japanese when in reality the Russian military still had problems at that time. They didn't get much better in the First World War. Beyond that, Schiff, together with journalist Kennan, they dropped leaflets promoting liberalism and reform to Russian POWs. So you could say, well, that also caused the revolution. Schiff supported Kerensky. He did not support the communists. And there's this big fanfare about how supposedly he gave 10,000 in cash directly to Trotsky in New York. This is that famous Judaism, Bolshevism report from the US government. Now, the problem is when you start delving into that and you find the source, it was someone by the name, I want to say Borisov, who had been a member of the secret police in Russia. He failed in an attempt to prosecute a Care Bear for ritual murder. So not exactly the guy who is the most, doesn't have potentially questionable motives. Bear in mind, the trial he was engaged in, the Care Bear was acquitted by an all-Christian jury. And I think the Tsar himself at the time said it was the right decision. So, there are cases where you can try to blame or scapegoat a group, and sometimes you got to go, well, maybe it's us. Maybe we need to change a little bit if we want to thrive. Unfortunately, that came too late. Freemasonry remained completely illegal. All lodge members needed to act in complete secrecy and were at risk. As we saw earlier, that's not true. They actually had legal Freemasonry. And by the way, just because Freemasons exist does not necessarily mean they're always detrimental. Like the Freemasons, some have claimed, brought down the Ottoman Empire, but this benefited a bunch of Christian empires when the Ottomans fell apart. So if in a different world, if let's say the Russian Empire remained intact, they probably would have gotten more territory of the Ottomans, which they desired and lusted after. Pornography was completely illegal. Yeah, that sounds impressive in the information age, but realistically speaking, back then it's going to be stuff that's printed, it's not on the internet, so less accessible. LGBTQ acts and values were completely illegal. That's not so uncommon for the time. Maybe you had some gay communities in Paris and London, but they weren't, popularly accepted, and gay pride flags, excuse me. Prostitution was legal, however, heavily controlled. So I'm guessing most Russian men did not use prophylactics. Is prostitution in such an instance worse or better than pornography? Because, you could spread syphilis or other diseases if you're just using it unsheathed all the time. Whores could not legally marry and would be buried outside of Christian cemeteries. But why? What if she's a Christian? Wasn't part of Christ's message about ministering to the downtrodden and giving them salvation? Like, it's strongly implied, at least by some, that the lady who was crying and washing his feet with her hair, she was a sexual degenerate. I don't want to get into the question of Mary Magdalene, but they want to advertise their faith as it's about the saving grace and love of Jesus Christ, but then they want to exclude degenerates, even though that's really how the message of the religion was structured in part. The Orthodox Church worked together with the state to run family courts, no alimony, divorce, fraud, etc. Okay, that probably was a better system, unless you're stuck with a psychopathic woman and you can't divorce her. It was difficult for non-Christians to get into university. Capital punishment existed. Between 94 and 7,000 criminals were tried and executed, most of them terrorists. That seems kind of low. They should have been more aggressive, maybe taken out a lot of the Bolsheviks. Adultery was a crime. Yiddish speakers could not become academics or work in any public office. Maybe not the best choice, though. You see, one of the reasons historically the Care Bears did well is because there was an emphasis on everyone having to know the law. You had to be able to read it. There was none of this, I'm just deferring constantly to the priest or the patriarch. And it's effective because it means that you have less illiteracy, and that is what set up a lot of Care Bears to work in certain industries, running tax systems, running the economy. Even the ones that converted, like in the Iberian Peninsula, they were still dominating those industries because there was that tradition of education. When it came to Catholicism and Orthodoxy, not so much. As long as you understood the oral practices and traditions, the priest would be the one typically who had most of the education. And what primarily changed that was one, Protestantism, and then eventually the liberal reforms of the 1800s. As you can see here, the Romanovs and the Tsars in general, Orthodox Christians, have been in charge of Russia for a while, but it's only until the late 1800s where, because of the movements in Europe, they start getting influence to make these shifts in their treatment of subjects or citizens. Legal age of marriage was 18 for men, 16 for women, but in actuality, they married later. Sharia law was allowed on certain 100% Islamic territories for Muslims only. Well, you said you're Christian supremacist, but you're giving Muslims their own law. That doesn't make any logical sense. You should be in charge of them and probably forcing them to convert if you're Christian supremacist. He had a dream of turning Palestine into a protectorate of the Russian Empire with free visa travel from both sides. So he's basically a Christian neoconservative. And this is fine. I had been in the aspirations of Russians for a long time, but you realize that if the Russians had taken over Palestine, you would still have some measure of religious war going on to this day. You really think the Muslim cells or the Care Bears would have just, oh, no big deal, you got it? No. Blueprints for rebuilding Orthodox Constantinople were already prepared by historians. Okay, so that would mean war with the Ottomans, where the Ottoman Empire has to collapse. You can go back further and say, oh, Disraeli opposed them taking over Constantinople together with the Austrians because he hated the Russians for how they treated Care Bears. All right, I can hand you that a bit. Now remember, though, as I noted earlier, when The Ottoman Empire collapsed, it was to the benefit of France and the UK. So, still these European, at least nominally Christian powers that are having an advantage. You could make the argument that if the UK had not controlled the oil supplies, the Middle East, they would have lost to the Germans, or it would have been much harder for them to win. Let's put it that way. Missionary work and future evangelism projects in China, Iran, and Mesopotamia were being conducted. Yeah, Iran is a tragedy. I wish they'd stayed Zoroastrian or become Christian. I think they would be a far more functional society nowadays. He was not Germanophobic, would never have allowed the Weimar experiment to take place. So, what would he have done? Would he have invaded? Would he have? I mean, I guess he could have tried to flex his muscles at the negotiating table, but that's up for debate too, because they might have said we lost so many casualties that we want to take a different position. And this is where people lose track of stuff because the Kaiser was a race realist, and of course, Tsar Nicholas was overseeing a multi ethnic empire. So I'm not sure he necessarily would have had the opinion that is being suggested here. The Tsar was against any form of parliamentary monarchy. Well, he did introduce a Duma, though. He tried to curtail its powers, but inevitably he would have had to become a constitutional monarch to survive, or his successors probably would have. The Tsar was planning the restoration of the Patriarchate. Interestingly enough, Patriarch Tikhon refused to give a full endorsement to the White Russians during the Civil War, and that's one of the reasons it did not galvanize Christians against the communists. His argument was, wait for it, we are not of this world. We should not get involved in these conflicts on Earth and disastrous outcomes. Many famous scientists and inventors were born and educated under his reign. All great Soviet inventors, generals, poets, artists went to school in the Russian Empire. That is not a flex, my friend. You see, you trained all the people that destroyed you and just horribly murdered your family and eradicated, centuries of tradition. I don't know if that's really something you should pat yourself on the back for. Abortion was a crime. The Babylonian Talmud was illegal. No printing or translating was allowed. That depends what you mean by the Babylonian Talmud. There was the Lithuanian issuance, which I think was actually acceptable in the Russian Empire. How many people were actually trying to use the Babylonian Talmud? How many people that are self proclaimed experts on the Talmud online even know what it entails? The Talmud is kind of an evolved series of debates, criticisms, commentaries, different opinions throughout the ages. It's not a blueprint for these people believe something, old Care Bears have this ideology. And the problem, too, because the church for the longest time was going after the Talmud. Depending on how you translate it, depending on the context, whether it was someone expressing an opinion that was not necessarily endorsed by others, it's difficult to come out with a clear-cut view, and so it's great. It's very inflammatory if you just take one thing, in of itself. Now, I'm open to any decent sources. I'm trying to get more on the blood ritual stuff, like if there's any truth to it, which you go up against the fact that it was consistently being debunked, and even there were popes saying, knock it off. This stuff is basically just you're defaming individuals, it's leading to violence. At the same time, there have been enough accusations throughout the years that you say maybe it was in there, but why weren't these Christian authorities able to establish clearly what was going on? But if you have something you can point me to, I'd be very interested. I'm still working on the book. I'm trying to be as balanced as possible, and also the narrative about worship of Moloch, Saturnalia. I'm interested in it, but I haven't found something that's okay. You can credibly present this to a normie and they're going to be able to, okay, I can go reference that as opposed to it's some lunatic ranting on the internet. So, yeah, as with anything else, history is more complex than the simple narratives of the internet. Uh, Care Bears, why were they in banking? Well, a lot of them ended up in banking because the Muslim cells taxed their agriculture too high, made it unproductive. They were also convenient to monarchs because the monarchs could use them to charge high rates of interest, 45, 80%, sometimes 100%. It was a way for the monarchs to extract revenue themselves, but they could also use it as a way, like a release valve of anger amongst the common people. They could cancel the debts that they owed to the Care Bears for their military campaigns, for their projects, like stuff like Karlskirche, beautiful church in Vienna, was financed by Care Bears, who were then told, yeah, go take a hike, we're not paying the money back, and they went bankrupt. So the Care Bears would charge higher rates of interest to the commoners, which made them very unpopular. And even in cases like in the UK, when they were kicked out, it's not like they ended usury and banking. They just brought in Italians to replace the Care Bears. So there are other cases like I think in Spain, they tried to ban it, kick them out, and they were saying it's hurting the economy too much. So, like everything else, and I get not many folks have time to look into it, but there's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of complexities. All we can do is try our best and not fall too readily into the hands of those who want to essentially go on hearsay all the time.